A little girl stood in a frozen alley, clutching a bent silver charm around her neck. Snow covered the ground like a silent warning. When a tall, well-dressed millionaire stepped toward her from the shadows, she didn't cry. She didn't run. She only looked up at him with eyes far older than 7 years and whispered the words that would haunt him forever. "You're not going to hurt me, are you, mister?" That single question stopped the man cold. Not because of fear, but because in that moment he realized something terrible. A child that young should never have to ask a stranger that question. And what he would discover in the next few hours would expose a secret system powerful enough to destroy reputations, fortunes, and the lives of children who had nowhere else to go. Before we begin, if stories about kindness, courage, and the fight for justice matter to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These stories remind us that even in the coldest moments of life, one person choosing to care can change everything. The night it all began, snow was falling sideways through a narrow alley behind a small diner called Mercer's. The diner had already closed for the night. The lights in the windows were dark, and the city's distant highway hummed like a tired heartbeat somewhere beyond the buildings. A flickering street lamp cast pale yellow light across the frozen pavement. Most people wouldn't walk down that alley. But Jacob Reed wasn't most people. 2 blocks away, a luxury charity gala was still in full swing. Crystal glasses clinked together. Wealthy donors laughed beneath chandeliers. Cameras flashed as philanthropists shook hands and promised to change the world. Jacob had been standing in the middle of it all only minutes earlier. A billionaire CEO. Founder of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. A man whose name showed up in business magazines and financial news. But that night, none of it felt real to him. The applause felt rehearsed. The speeches felt empty. And the promises of helping struggling families sounded strange coming from people who had never struggled a day in their lives. So Jacob slipped away. He walked out of the ballroom quietly, leaving behind the music and polite smiles. In his hand he carried a paper cup of hot cider he had grabbed from a catering table on his way out. He told himself he just needed air. But sometimes the heart leads us somewhere we were never planning to go. Snow crunched under his polished shoes as he turned the corner behind Mercer's diner. And that's when he heard the voice. Small. Soft. Not crying. Just careful. Jacob stopped. At first he thought he imagined it. But then he saw them. A pair of worn sneakers standing on the icy pavement. Too thin for winter. Too small to belong to anyone who should be outside alone at night. His eyes moved upward slowly. A little girl stood in the alley, bundled in an oversized coat that looked like it had belonged to someone twice her size. The sleeves swallowed her hands, and the hem hung almost to her knees. Her light hair was tied back unevenly, as if someone had tried to fix it in a hurry. Snow clung to her eyelashes. But she wasn't shivering. She stood very still. Too still. Like someone who had learned that sudden movements could make situations worse. Jacob's heart tightened in his chest. 7 years old. Maybe 8. And completely alone. For a moment neither of them spoke. The girl studied him carefully. Not like a child. More like someone evaluating a situation. The way adults do when they are deciding whether something is safe or dangerous. Then she tilted her head slightly and asked the question. "You're not going to hurt me, are you, mister?" The words were calm. Polite even. But they landed in Jacob's chest like a punch. Because children who grow up in safe homes don't ask questions like that. Jacob froze exactly where he was. He didn't step closer. He didn't reach out. Instead he slowly raised both hands where she could see them, palms open. "No," he said quietly. "Just one word. No promises. No sudden friendliness. Just the truth." The girl watched his hands very carefully. Not his face. His hands. Jacob noticed that. So he moved slowly. He took the thick scarf from around his neck and placed it gently on top of a wooden crate sitting between them. Then he set the cup of hot cider beside it. "I figured you might want something warm," he said softly. "No pressure." Then he took a step back. The wind pushed snow through the alley, swirling between them. For several seconds the girl didn't move. She studied him again, measuring, calculating. Then she crossed the distance quickly, like a stray cat that had survived too many winters. She grabbed the scarf first, then the cup. She tested the lid before lifting it. Smart. Careful. As she raised the drink, the sleeve of her coat slipped back slightly. That's when Jacob saw it. A small silver charm hanging from a thin cord around her neck. The metal was bent, twisted out of shape like it had once been crushed and straightened again. Her fingers immediately closed around it protectively, like it was the most important thing she owned. The wind shifted, and suddenly Jacob heard something else. An engine, idling, at the far end of the alley. He didn't turn his head right away, but after a moment he slowly glanced toward the street. A black SUV sat beneath the dim streetlight, the engine running, headlights off. Watching, Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just a random meeting. He looked back at the girl. "You waiting for someone?" he asked gently. She took a small sip of the cider. Swallowed. "My aunt," she said. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly. Jacob nodded slowly. "How long you been waiting?" She shrugged. "Since it got dark." Snow gathered on her hair again. She didn't brush it away. And just as Jacob was about to speak again, the SUV's headlights flickered once, then went dark. But the engine kept running. And suddenly Jacob realized something chilling. The girl had already noticed that vehicle long before he did. The girl didn't look frightened by the SUV. That was what unsettled Jacob the most. Children usually reacted to strange cars with fear or curiosity. They stared. They pointed. They asked questions. But this little girl had already filed the vehicle away in her mind like a fact she'd learned not to challenge. She knew it was there. And she knew better than to acknowledge it. Jacob kept his voice calm. "You sure your aunt knows you're here?" The girl took another careful sip of the cider before answering. "She always knows." Again, the answer came too easily, too polished. Jacob had spent 20 years building companies and negotiating deals with people who hid the truth behind smooth words. He had learned something important during those years. The truth often stumbles. Lies walk in straight lines. Snow drifted through the alley as the wind picked up again. The street lamp flickered above them, casting long shadows against the brick walls. Jacob slipped one hand slowly into the pocket of his coat and pulled out his phone. But he kept the movement slow and obvious. The girl's eyes followed it immediately. "I'm going to call someone to help," he said gently. "Just to make sure you're safe tonight." Her reaction was instant. "Don't." The word came out soft, but sharp enough to stop him. Jacob paused. The girl's fingers tightened around the bent silver charm hanging from her neck. Her knuckles turned pale as she squeezed it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. At the far end of the alley, the SUV's engine suddenly shut off. Silence rolled through the narrow space like fog. Jacob felt the tension settle deep in his chest. He looked back at the girl. "If someone was coming to pick you up," he said carefully, "they probably would have been here by now." Her eyes didn't blink. The wind carried a swirl of snow between them. Then she spoke again, her voice so quiet it almost disappeared under the sound of the storm. "If you're going to leave, do it quick." Jacob felt those words settle heavily in his chest. She hadn't said them with anger. She hadn't said them with accusation. She had said them like instructions. Like someone who had learned a painful lesson over and over again. People promise to stay. Then they don't. For a moment Jacob looked down at the scarf now wrapped around her neck and the cup warming her small hands. The girl wasn't afraid of the cold. She was afraid of hope. Because hope meant believing someone might stay. And believing that made it hurt worse when they walked away. Jacob took a slow breath. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not a promise. A decision." Somewhere in the distance, faint music drifted through the city air from the gala he had just walked away from. Laughter. Applause. The comfortable world of wealthy people celebrating their generosity. It sounded very far away now. Jacob Reed stood in the narrow alley between two very different worlds. One filled with polished speeches and million-dollar donations. The other standing barefoot on frozen pavement, holding a paper cup like it was the first warm thing she had touched all night. He looked down at his phone again. Then he dialed. The girl watched him carefully. He spoke calmly when the operator answered. "Yes," he said. "I'm behind Mercer's Diner on Halsted Avenue. There's a miner here. She appears to be alone and unsheltered." He paused briefly. "I'd like an officer sent over. Preferably someone experienced with children." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat. The girl didn't look angry, but she stepped back slightly, placing the wooden crate between them again. Creating distance. Creating protection. Red and blue lights appeared only minutes later, flashing across the brick walls of the alley. As the patrol car turned onto the street, the black SUV at the end of the block suddenly came back to life. Its engine started. Headlights flicked on. Then the vehicle rolled forward and disappeared into the night. Not fast. Not rushed. Just gone. A woman stepped out of the police car. She looked to be in her mid-30s, bundled in a winter jacket with calm, steady eyes that immediately scanned the scene. Officer Lena Ortiz. She noticed Jacob first. A wealthy man in a tailored coat standing in a dark alley with a little girl. For a brief moment her posture stiffened. Then she looked at the girl. And her expression softened. Ortiz approached slowly and crouched down so she was at the girl's height. "Hey there," she said gently. "I'm Officer Lena. What's your name?" The girl didn't answer. Her fingers tightened around the silver charm again. Ortiz didn't push. Instead she removed her gloves and placed them on the ground beside her, showing her empty hands. "No one's in trouble tonight," she said softly. The girl's shoulders lowered slightly. After a moment she finally spoke. "Lily." Jacob exhaled quietly. "Lily Harper." An ambulance arrived shortly after. The medic took one look at the thin coat, the worn sneakers, and the frost gathering in Lily's hair. "Her body temperature's dropping," he said calmly. "We're taking her to the hospital to warm her up." A thermal blanket was wrapped around Lily's shoulders. Jacob stepped back immediately, giving the professional space. He made sure every movement he made was visible. Careful. Respectful. In a situation like this, a wealthy man helping a child could easily be misunderstood. And the last thing Lily needed was another complication. While the paramedics worked, Jacob pulled out his phone again and made another call. His lawyer answered on the second ring. "Miles," Jacob said quietly. "Document this." There was a pause on the other end. "Document what?" "A welfare call initiated by me," Jacob replied. "Police present. EMS present. Minor transported for medical evaluation." He spoke deliberately. Clearly. "I want everything on record." Across the ambulance, Lily watched him carefully. Not with fear. Not with gratitude. With the same quiet calculation she had shown since the beginning. Like she was trying to understand something. The ambulance doors closed. As the vehicle pulled away toward the hospital, Lily sat inside wrapped in the thermal blanket. Her fingers still clutched the bent silver charm. And through the small back window, her eyes stayed fixed on Jacob Reed. The ambulance lights faded into the snow-covered street, but Jacob didn't move. For a long moment he simply stood there in the alley, staring at the empty road where the vehicle had disappeared. Officer Ortiz studied him carefully. Most wealthy men she encountered at charity events didn't follow ambulances to hospitals. They donated money, shook hands, and returned to warm ballrooms where problems felt distant and abstract. Jacob Reed, however, was still standing in a freezing alley long after the moment of kindness had technically ended. "You planning to come down to the hospital?" Ortiz asked calmly. Jacob looked at her. "Is that allowed?" "As long as you stay in the waiting area and don't interfere," she replied. "Yeah." He nodded once. "Then I'll be there." The drive through the city felt strangely quiet. Snow softened the streets and muted the usual noise of traffic. Streetlights passed in long yellow streaks across the windshield of Jacob's car as he followed the route toward St. Vincent Medical Center. His mind kept replaying the same moment. A small girl looking up at him. "You're not going to hurt me, are you, mister?" It wasn't the words that stayed with him. It was the way she said them. Carefully. Like she had asked that question before. More than once. The hospital waiting room was warm but sterile, filled with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of disinfectant. Jacob checked in quietly at the front desk. "I'm here about a child who came in with EMS," he said. "Lily Harper." The nurse behind the desk glanced at the screen. "Family." Jacob paused. "No." She studied him for a moment. "Just someone who found her," he said honestly. The nurse nodded. "You can wait over there." Jacob sat down in a molded plastic chair across the room. The place was half full. A tired mother rocked a crying toddler near the window. An older man coughed quietly into a handkerchief while flipping through a worn magazine. A young couple whispered anxiously beside a vending machine. Life happening in quiet emergencies. Jacob leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He realized something strange. He hadn't thought about the gala once since leaving. Not about the donors. Not about the cameras. Not about the board members who would soon be asking where their CEO had disappeared to. All he could think about was that little girl. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the doors to the treatment area opened. Lily stepped out wrapped in a fresh hospital blanket. Her coat had been replaced with a pair of loose gray sweatpants and a small hoodie that clearly belonged to the hospital's spare clothing supply. A nurse walked beside her, guiding her gently toward a chair. Lily didn't look around the room like most children would. She immediately scanned the exits, the doors, the hallway. And then she saw Jacob. For a moment she froze. Not surprised. Just confirming something. Jacob lifted a hand slightly in greeting but didn't stand up or approach. He understood something about her now. Too much attention might feel like pressure. The nurse spoke softly. "You can sit here for a bit while we get a social worker," she told Lily. Lily nodded and lowered herself into the chair. Her feet barely touched the floor. The bent silver charm still hung around her neck. Her fingers rested lightly on it like it was an anchor. Across the room, the toddler near the window began crying again. Sharp, frightened sobs that echoed through the quiet waiting room. The exhausted mother tried rocking him, whispering softly, but nothing seemed to calm him. Lily watched for a moment. Then she slowly slid off her chair. The nurse noticed but didn't stop her. Lily walked over to the toddler. She didn't kneel. She didn't smile. She simply placed her small hand gently on the boy's sleeve, and whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear. The crying stopped almost instantly. The toddler blinked, confused. Lily stepped back immediately. like she had broken some kind of rule. Jacob felt something tighten in his chest. That wasn't normal behavior for a 7-year-old. That was the behavior of a child who had learned how to survive in tense rooms, how to quiet problems, how to avoid attention. The doors opened again. This time a woman in her 40s stepped out holding a tablet. A social worker. She approached the nurse and quietly asked for the child's name. Lily Harper, the nurse replied. The woman typed quickly. Then she froze. Her expression shifted almost instantly. Not shock. Something closer to dread. She stepped aside and made a quiet phone call near the hallway. Jacob noticed the change immediately. He stood up and walked slowly toward the counter. Is everything all right? He asked. The woman lowered her voice. There's history here. What kind of history? She hesitated. Then she angled the tablet slightly so Jacob could see the screen. A case file filled the display. Placement records. Transfer notes. Short-term evaluations. Multiple temporary homes listed one after another. The dates were close together. Too close. The same organization appeared again and again at the top of the paperwork. Hayes Children's Foundation. The name hit Jacob like a dull echo from earlier that evening. He knew that foundation. His company had donated to it during last year's charity gala. He remembered the handshake, the photographs, the man who ran it. Richard Hayes, a philanthropist who built his reputation around helping vulnerable children. Jacob stared at the logo glowing at the top of the screen. Across the room, Lily had returned to her chair. She sat quietly again, scanning the room, waiting for the next adult decision to be made about her life. Jacob slowly looked back at the social worker. Why does her file keep reopening? He asked. The woman hesitated before answering. Because some truths are difficult to say out loud. Finally she spoke. Because it never closes. Jacob felt a chill move slowly through his chest. Not from the winter. From the growing sense that something about Lily Harper's story was deeply wrong. And somewhere in that tangled paperwork, someone had been making sure it stayed that way. Jacob stared at the tablet a moment longer. The words on the screen didn't move, but somehow they felt alive. Placement. Transfer. Temporary care. Reassignment. Dates stacked close together like someone had been passing a child from door to door without ever letting her stay long enough to belong anywhere. Across the room, Lily sat quietly in her chair. Her feet still didn't quite touch the floor. She was watching the hallway again. Always watching. Like she expected someone to appear at any moment and tell her where she was going next. Jacob slowly lifted his eyes from the tablet. How many homes? He asked quietly. The social worker swallowed. I'm still scrolling. Her finger moved across the screen. 1 page. 2 pages. 3. Each page looked almost identical. New address. New temporary placement. Short evaluation period. Then another transfer request. The same organization stamped across every document. Hayes Children's Foundation. Jacob felt something tighten inside his chest. That doesn't look normal, he said. The social worker gave a small, humorless breath. It isn't. She turned the tablet slightly so he could see more clearly. Most children in the system move a few times, she explained softly. Sometimes families don't work out. Sometimes people mean well but realize they're not prepared. Her finger stopped on one particular date. But this, she said quietly, this is constant movement. Jacob studied the timeline. Weeks. Sometimes days. Why would that happen? He asked. The woman hesitated. Then she spoke the kind of sentence people in difficult professions learn to say carefully. Sometimes organizations claim they're providing specialized evaluations. And that allows them to move a child between facilities. Jacob's jaw tightened slightly. For how long? She shook her head. Too long. Jacob leaned back slightly from the counter. His mind replayed something Lily had said earlier in the alley. If you're going to leave, do it quick. Those weren't the words of a child waiting for family. Those were the words of a child who had learned not to expect anyone to stay. Across the waiting room, Lily had picked up a paper cup of water the nurse had left beside her chair. She held it with both hands but didn't drink. Instead, she watched a pair of nurses walking down the hallway. Her eyes tracked their movement carefully. Jacob noticed something else. Every time footsteps passed behind her chair, her shoulders tensed slightly. Not dramatically. Just a small shift. Like someone preparing for impact. The social worker noticed it too. She's been through a lot, she said quietly. Jacob nodded. But something inside him was starting to feel less like sympathy and more like concern. Real concern. The kind that settles in your chest when something doesn't make sense. Who runs the foundation? He asked. You mean Hayes? Yes. The woman sighed softly. Richard Hayes. Big name in the charity world. Jacob knew that part already. Richard Hayes was the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers next to headlines about generosity and social impact. The kind of man invited to speak at galas. The kind of man Jacob himself had stood beside in photographs just a year earlier. The memory surfaced clearly now. A ballroom filled with donors. Richard Hayes shaking hands with a warm smile. Talking about protecting vulnerable children. Talking about giving them stability, hope, a future. Jacob felt something cold move through him. Does anyone monitor how these placements are handled? He asked. They're supposed to, the woman said carefully. Supposed to. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked across the room at Lily. The little girl had finally taken a sip of water. Her hands were steady. Her expression calm. Too calm. Then the social worker lowered her voice. Sometimes systems get complicated. Jacob frowned slightly. Complicated how? The woman hesitated. Like she was deciding how much she should say in a public waiting room. Finally she spoke quietly. Complicated enough that certain cases keep moving through the same organizations without ever being fully reviewed. Jacob felt his pulse slow. The kind of slow that comes when the brain begins putting pieces together. Meaning someone is steering it, he said. The social worker didn't answer. But she didn't disagree either. At that moment the doors to the hallway opened again. Officer Lena Ortiz stepped into the waiting room. She spotted Jacob and walked over. Everything all right here? She asked. The social worker straightened slightly. We're reviewing Lily Harper's case. Ortiz nodded. Figured there'd be paperwork. The social worker turned the tablet so Ortiz could see. The officer studied the screen for several seconds. Then her expression shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. That's a lot of transfers, she said. Exactly, the social worker replied. Ortiz looked up slowly. Who signed off on them? The woman tapped the top of the document. A name appeared in formal script beneath the foundation logo. Richard Hayes. For a moment none of them spoke. Across the room, Lily's fingers tightened around the bent silver charm again. Almost like she could feel the adults talking about her future without understanding the words. Jacob watched her quietly. He realized something in that moment. The girl had survived by staying quiet. By not asking questions. By not expecting fairness. And maybe that was exactly how the system around her had managed to keep moving her from place to place without anyone stopping it. Jacob looked back at the tablet. Then at the logo glowing on the screen. Hayes Children's Foundation. He remembered writing the donation check, remembered believing the speech, remembered thinking he was helping. Now he wasn't so sure. And across the waiting room, Lily Harper sat alone again, waiting patiently for the next adult decision to decide where she would be sent next. Jacob kept staring at the name on the screen. Richard Hayes. It looked clean, official, respected. The kind of name that appeared on plaques, scholarship programs, and hospital wings. But tonight it was sitting at the top of a file that felt wrong. Officer Ortiz leaned one shoulder against the counter beside the social worker. "You ever see a case bounce around like that?" she asked quietly. The woman shook her head. "Not this many times." Jacob's gaze drifted back across the waiting room. Lily had placed the empty paper cup beside her chair. Her hands rested in her lap now, fingers loosely curled around the bent silver charm. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't looking bored. She was simply waiting. Like waiting was something she had practiced her whole life. A nurse walked past her chair. Lily's eyes followed the movement immediately. Not curious. Prepared. Jacob noticed the same thing he had seen earlier in the alley. She didn't watch faces. She watched hands. Watched doors. Watched exits. The habits of a child who had learned to read rooms instead of trusting them. Ortiz noticed Jacob studying her. "She's been doing that since we got here," the officer murmured. "Watching everything." Jacob nodded. "She's used to being moved." The words tasted bitter even as he said them. Behind them, the social worker kept scrolling through the file. A new page loaded. Then another. The woman's eyebrows slowly pulled together. "That's strange," she muttered. Ortiz glanced back. "What is?" The woman turned the tablet slightly. "These placement transfers, they're all connected to partner facilities." "Partner facilities?" Jacob asked. "Organizations that work alongside the foundation," she explained. "Evaluation homes. Short-term care sites. Specialized programs." Jacob studied the screen. The addresses looked different. Different towns. Different buildings. But the administrative contact was the same. Hayes Children's Foundation. Like spokes connected to the same hub. Ortiz exhaled quietly. "So the kid gets moved around inside the same network." "Exactly." Jacob felt a slow heaviness settle in his chest. A system. Not chaos. Movement that looked random but wasn't. Across the waiting room, Lily shifted slightly in her chair. Not restless. Just adjusting the hospital blanket around her shoulders. For a moment her sleeve slid back. Jacob noticed faint marks along her wrist. Not bruises. Old. Faded. Like skin that had healed after too many rough moments. The blanket slipped back into place before anyone else seemed to notice. Jacob looked away. His jaw tightened slightly. The social worker locked the tablet screen and looked up. "I need to notify Child Services about this history," she said. Ortiz nodded. "Already started that process." Jacob stayed quiet. Something in his mind was still turning. Richard Hayes. The smiling face at charity dinners. The speeches about protecting children. And somewhere inside the paperwork, a girl who kept disappearing from one place and appearing in another. "Does Lily have family?" Jacob asked after a moment. The social worker hesitated. "Her mother passed away 3 years ago." The words landed softly but heavily. "What happened?" "Medical complications," the woman said gently. "She was a single parent." Jacob looked back at Lily. The little girl had leaned back slightly in her chair. Her eyes were half closed. Not asleep. Just resting. Like someone who had learned to take quiet moments whenever they appeared. "No father listed?" Jacob asked. "None in the file." For a moment the waiting room filled with the quiet hum of fluorescent lights again. Life moving around them. People coming and going. Ordinary problems. Ordinary pain. But Lily Harper's life didn't look ordinary. Ortiz straightened slightly as the hallway doors opened again. A woman stepped out carrying a thick folder. CPS. She walked directly toward the counter. "Lily Harper?" she asked. The social worker nodded and handed her the tablet. The CPS worker scanned the file quickly. Her expression grew tighter with each page. "Yeah," she said under her breath. "What?" Ortiz asked. The woman glanced around before lowering her voice. "This case keeps reopening." Jacob had heard those words already, but hearing them again didn't make them feel any better. "Why?" he asked. The CPS worker closed the file halfway. "Because every time we think it's resolved, she ends up back in the system again." "How?" "Transfers." The same word. Over and over. Jacob felt something deep in his chest shift. A quiet anger. The kind that grows slowly instead of exploding. Across the room, Lily opened her eyes. She looked toward the adults at the counter. Not curious. Just aware that her name had been spoken. Their eyes met. Jacob saw something there. Not hope. Hope would be too dangerous. Just recognition. Like she already understood something about the world that most children her age shouldn't have to learn. The CPS worker walked toward her chair and crouched down. "Hey, Lily," she said gently. "We're going to talk for a little while, okay?" Lily nodded once. "Okay." Her voice was soft but steady. The woman smiled kindly. "Did someone bring you to the hospital tonight?" Lily's eyes moved briefly toward Jacob, then back to the worker. "Yes." "Who?" She pointed quietly. "The man from the alley." Jacob felt the room grow slightly quieter around him. The CPS worker looked over at him. "Jacob Reed." He nodded. "That's right." The woman studied him carefully. Not suspicious. Just measuring. "Thank you for staying," she said. Jacob glanced at Lily again. Someone had to. The CPS worker stood. "We'll need to arrange temporary placement tonight." Jacob felt something tighten in his chest. Temporary. Another move. Another door. Another unfamiliar room. Across the waiting area, Lily's fingers slowly closed around the bent silver charm again. The CPS worker continued speaking. "We'll likely place her back with the Foundation's network until a review hearing." Jacob's voice cut in quietly. "Back with Hayes." The room went still for a moment. The worker frowned slightly. "Why?" Jacob looked at Lily, then back at the adults around him. "Because if what's in that file is true," he said slowly, "sending her back there might be the worst place she could go." And at that exact moment, the hospital entrance doors slid open. A tall man in an expensive charcoal coat stepped inside. Snow dusted across his shoulders. His posture calm. His smile polite. Jacob recognized him immediately. Richard Hayes. The hospital doors slid closed behind Richard Hayes with a soft mechanical sigh. Snowflakes clung to the shoulders of his charcoal coat, slowly melting under the fluorescent lights. He brushed them away calmly, like a man used to entering important rooms without needing to hurry. His eyes moved through the waiting area in one smooth sweep. Nurses. Patients. The CPS worker. Officer Ortiz. And then they landed on Jacob Reed. For a brief moment, the polite smile on Hayes's face shifted into something slightly more precise. Recognition. "Well," Hayes said, walking forward with measured confidence. "Jacob Reed. I didn't expect to see you here tonight." His voice carried the same warmth Jacob remembered from the gala stage. Smooth. Reassuring. carefully practiced. Jacob didn't move. I could say the same thing, he replied. Hayes stopped a few feet away and extended a hand out of habit. Jacob didn't take it. The hand remained in the air for a second before Hayes lowered it gracefully, as if the moment had never happened. No offense taken, Hayes said lightly. Hospitals make people tense. Officer Ortiz stepped slightly closer to the counter. And you are? She asked. Hayes reached calmly into his coat pocket and produced a leather card holder. Richard Hayes, he said, offering the ID. Founder of Hayes Children's Foundation. Ortiz examined the identification briefly before handing it back. What brings you here tonight, Mr. Hayes? His expression shifted to one of gentle concern. I was informed that one of our supported children had been admitted this evening, he explained. We take those situations very seriously. Supported children. The phrasing slid through the room with quiet precision. Jacob watched every movement carefully. Hayes never looked toward Lily. Not once. His eyes stayed on the adults. Because adults made decisions. Children simply lived with them. The CPS worker cleared her throat. We're reviewing Lily Harper's case now, she said. Her placement situation is complicated. Hayes nodded slowly. Yes, he said sympathetically. Some children have very difficult circumstances. Across the waiting room, Lily watched the conversation without speaking. Her small fingers tightened around the bent silver charm. Jacob noticed the moment Hayes finally glanced toward her. It happened quickly. Just a brief look. But something about it felt different. Not warmth. Calculation. Then Hayes returned his attention to the group. Our foundation has been assisting with Lily's care for some time, he said, providing evaluations, temporary housing, specialized support when necessary. The CPS worker flipped through the folder she was holding. There have been many transfers. Yes, Hayes said calmly. Why? Officer Ortiz asked. Hayes gave a small, patient smile. Children who experience trauma sometimes require multiple evaluations before a permanent placement can be determined. The explanation sounded reasonable, almost comforting. But Jacob felt something in his chest tighten again. Because the explanation sounded rehearsed. Across the room, Lily slowly slid her feet off the chair and stood. She walked quietly to the nearby water cooler. No one stopped her. But Jacob noticed something. Lily didn't look toward Hayes at all. She kept her eyes on the floor. On the hallway. On the exits. Anywhere but him. The CPS worker closed the folder slowly. There will need to be a court review before any new placement decisions are made. Hayes nodded again. Of course. Agreement without resistance. The perfect public response. Jacob stepped forward slightly. You said your foundation has been assisting her, he said. Hayes turned his head. Yes. Jacob held his gaze. She asked me something tonight. Hayes tilted his head slightly. What was that? Jacob didn't look away. She asked if I was going to hurt her. For the first time, a brief pause entered Hayes's composure. Just a fraction of a second. Then the smile returned. Children in unstable environments often develop defensive instincts, he said gently. Unstable environments. The phrase floated through the air. Shifting responsibility somewhere else. Somewhere vague. Jacob felt the slow burn of anger growing deeper in his chest. Officer Ortiz spoke before he could respond. We're still reviewing her records. Hayes nodded politely. Take all the time you need. He adjusted his coat cuffs as he spoke. Across the room, Lily had returned to her chair. She sat down quietly. Her eyes lifted for a moment and met Jacob's. Not pleading. Just asking one silent question. Are you staying? Jacob gave a small nod. Hayes noticed the exchange. His gaze sharpened slightly. "Mr. Reed," he said softly. "Yes." Public involvement in cases like this can sometimes create unnecessary complications. Jacob turned fully toward him. "Complications for who?" Hayes's smile widened just a fraction. "For the child." The words hung there, carefully chosen. Jacob felt the room shrink slightly around them, like the cold alley had followed them inside. The CPS worker stepped between them subtly. "We'll notify all parties once the review hearing is scheduled." Hayes nodded. "I look forward to cooperating." Always cooperative. That was the armor. Hayes glanced at Lily one more time, then back at Jacob. "A word of advice," he said quietly. His voice dropped just low enough that only Jacob could hear it. "Systems like this are intricate." Jacob didn't blink. "And interfering with them," Hayes continued, "can create consequences people rarely expect." Jacob held his gaze. "So can silence." For a brief moment Hayes's smile thinned. Then he straightened his coat. "Good evening, everyone." He turned and walked toward the exit. The automatic doors opened again, letting a gust of cold winter air roll into the waiting room. Jacob watched him leave. And as Hayes stepped outside into the falling snow, Jacob noticed something else. Across the street, parked beneath a dim streetlight, a black SUV sat quietly with its engine running. The same kind of vehicle he had seen earlier in the alley. Watching. Jacob watched the black SUV through the glass doors until its headlights slowly disappeared into the falling snow. For a long moment he didn't move. Behind him the hospital waiting room returned to its quiet rhythm. Nurses walked past with clipboards. A distant monitor beeped somewhere down the hallway. The ordinary sounds of a building where lives were constantly shifting between fear and relief. But something had changed inside Jacob Reed. He turned back toward the room. Lily was still sitting in her chair, small, wrapped in a hospital blanket, her fingers resting on the bent silver charm like it was the only thing in the world that had stayed with her long enough to matter. Officer Ortiz stepped beside him. "You saw that SUV too, didn't you?" she said quietly. Jacob nodded once. "Yes." Ortiz looked toward the doors thoughtfully. "That kind of car doesn't just sit around hospitals for no reason." The CPS worker closed the folder she had been holding. "We're moving Lily to a temporary safe placement tonight," she said. "Not connected to the foundation." Jacob felt a small piece of tension ease inside his chest. But only a little. Because the problem wasn't just tonight. It was everything that had happened before it. Across the room, Lily watched them again. Still silent. Still measuring. The CPS worker approached her slowly. "Hey, Lily," she said gently. "We're going to take you somewhere warm for a while." Lily looked up. Another house? The question wasn't hopeful. It was practical. The woman crouched beside her. "For now, yes." Lily nodded once. No argument. No tears. Just acceptance. Jacob felt something deep in his chest twist painfully. A 7-year-old who had already learned that home was something temporary. The CPS worker stood again. "We'll begin a full investigation into the Foundation's placement records," she said to Ortiz. Ortiz nodded. "I'll make sure the report includes everything from tonight." Jacob spoke quietly. "And the SUV?" Ortiz gave a small half-smile. "We noticed." The room fell into a brief silence again. Then Lily slid off her chair. The hospital blanket fell slightly from her shoulders as she walked over. Not toward the CPS worker. Not toward Ortiz. Toward Jacob. She stopped a few feet in front of him. Her eyes searched his face carefully. The same way they had in the alley. You stayed, she said. Jacob crouched slightly so they were closer to the same height. I told you I would. Lily's fingers tightened around the bent silver charm. Most people don't. Jacob didn't answer right away. Because some truths are easier to show than explain. The CPS worker gently placed a small winter coat around Lily's shoulders. We're ready when you are. Lily looked back at Jacob one more time. Will I see you again? Jacob could feel every adult in the room watching the moment quietly. This wasn't a promise he could make lightly. But he also knew something in his heart that had already changed. Yes, he said softly. I'll make sure of it. Lily studied him for another second. Then she nodded, like she had just decided to believe something she normally wouldn't. The next weeks unfolded slowly. Investigations began. Documents were reviewed. Questions were asked in rooms where answers had been avoided for too long. Officer Ortiz and CPS worked through the records connected to the Foundation's network. Transfer logs. Financial statements. Placement histories. Patterns appeared. The kind of patterns that had once been hidden beneath polite speeches and charity dinners. Richard Hayes remained calm in public interviews. But systems built on silence tend to weaken when people start speaking. And people were starting to speak. Meanwhile, Lily stayed in temporary care. A small, quiet home run by a couple who believed patience mattered more than perfection. She didn't talk much at first. But she listened. Watched. Slowly learning that some doors didn't close behind you forever. Jacob visited whenever he was allowed. Sometimes bringing books. Sometimes just sitting at the kitchen table while Lily colored pictures beside him. There were awkward silences. Small conversations. Moments where Lily looked toward the door like she expected someone to say it was time to move again. But each time she looked up, Jacob was still there. Weeks turned into months. Investigations continued. And one spring morning, sunlight finally replaced the winter snow that had filled that alley the night everything began. Jacob stood outside the small house, leaning against the porch railing while Lily chased a stray dandelion across the yard. Her laughter was quiet but real. The kind of sound that takes time to return to a child. She ran back toward him, slightly out of breath. Look what I found. She held up the bent silver charm. The metal now rested on a simple bracelet Jacob had helped repair so it wouldn't cut her skin anymore. Still crooked, she said. Jacob smiled. Some things don't need to be perfect to be strong. Lily looked down at it thoughtfully. Then she looked up at him. The question in her eyes was different now. Not fear. Not calculation. Just something small and hopeful. Are you staying today? Jacob looked out at the quiet yard. Then back at her. Yes, he said gently. I'm staying. And for the first time since that cold night behind Mercer's diner. Lily didn't look like a child waiting to be moved. She looked like someone who finally believed she belonged somewhere. Because sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins in a quiet moment when one person refuses to walk away. And in the end, the truth that matters most is simple. Money can build buildings. Power can move systems. But love is the only thing strong enough to rebuild a life. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing stories that remind us kindness still matters. And tell me in the comments, which region of the world are you watching from today?